what we see is a large and I think growing gap between the potential amount of output that could be produced given the amount of land and labor being used in agriculture and what's actually being produced.
Welcome to VoxDev Talks. My name is Tim Phillips. Agriculture makes up a large share of employment and GDP in Africa, but crop yields remain stubbornly low. The latest VoxDev Lit to be published by VoxDev is issue 2 of Agricultural Technology in Africa, which reviews what the published literature can and cannot explain about this stagnation. And it also suggests directions in research that are throwing a new light on what policies and investments could make a difference. Chris Udry of Northwestern is one of the senior editors. He joins me now. Chris, welcome to VoxDev Talks.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Chris, give me some background about this stagnation that I mentioned in technological progress in Africa and how it relates to the sort of progress we've seen elsewhere.
So the stagnation is apparent and has been going on for decades. To put it in context, African food production has been increasing rapidly. Land use in agriculture has been increasing. Labor used in agriculture has been increasing. All of these have been going on because the population is growing. They need more food. There are more people to grow that food. What hasn't been increasing are yields, or much more importantly, profits. Yields have been fairly stagnant. That's output per acre or hectare. And the value of output being produced, conditional on the value of inputs being used, has been stuck. And so the technology that's being used in agriculture has been changing very slowly. The kind of gains in total factor productivity that we've seen in other economies during transition in the process of development has not been occurring in Africa. Almost all the growth in production has been extensive, people moving out to new areas and extending the amount of land being used in production. What we see is actually, in many cases, an actual decline in yields as people struggle to make enough money in farming to survive. So what we see is a large and, I think, growing gap between the potential amount of output that could be produced given the amount of land and labor being used in agriculture and what's actually being produced.
If we could possibly close this yield gap that you've described, what difference would it make in the day-to-day lives of farmers, smallholders in Africa?
It would make an enormous difference in people's lives. If we could close the profit gap, we would find people's living standards rising immediately, because it's that poor agricultural productivity that's the proximate cause of continued rural poverty in Africa. And I switched from talking about the yield gap to the profit gap because I'm part of the reason for this problem. Yields are irrelevant in themselves. We don't care how many bushels of wheat are produced on an acre of land. What we care about is how much farmers earn from growing their wheat or rice or corn. So it's really profit gaps that we should be talking about.
Is there one big problem, one dominant constraint, a particular lever that you think we could pull to change this?
If only we could. There's a lever, potentially, and that's technology. And that's the development of new varieties of crops, new techniques of production, increased total factor productivity. That's been the source of the growth in wealth in all developing countries.
So in the VoxDev Lit, you go into a really interesting detail on how the adoption of technology is held up by various constraints. You explain a little bit more about some of them for me. A first one, credit and liquidity, the idea that farmers just don't have enough money.
We found in research across Africa that very often farmers are reluctant to invest in a new technology because there are discrete costs associated with that. In order to use a new variety or a new technique, they are required to invest substantial amounts of labor or capital in advance. And there's always a gap between when you make an investment in your farm and when you harvest your farm in agriculture. And that seasonal gap means that you have to have a way of transferring resources over time in order to make the investments you need to start with a new technology. That gap sometimes sometimes can be surmounted, and in many cases is, but in other parts of Africa, you have a population that's living almost hand to mouth, and it's very difficult to accumulate enough resources or to borrow enough resources to make the investments that you need to intensify production and use new technology.
How does insurance factor into this?
In a very parallel way. If you talk with the farmer about why she's not using fertilizer, for example, her first answer will often be, because I don't have the money for it. Mm-hmm. That's the credit constraint we just talked about. The second answer she's often going to give is because it's too risky. If I use your fertilizer and it doesn't rain, then not only do I not get the gains from using the fertilizer, I've lost all the money that I've invested in it beforehand. And so an inadequate ability to ensure your output in the face of a very risky production process that depends upon rainfall and other totally external shocks to you makes it really difficult for people to adopt.
So how important is a lack of knowledge in all of this, that farmers would be able to improve their yields, their profits, if only they knew what they should do about it?
It's clear that knowledge matters, that there are ideas that are generated either from the formal agricultural research system or from other farmers in other areas, and information doesn't flow perfectly freely across space or even over time. And so there are avenues for learning that could be productive for farmers. However, we've not found really strong evidence that very profitable innovations are hindered for long in their diffusion by lack of knowledge. It's usually the tweaks, the smaller things that you might be able to improve productivity with information. If we had a great new technology, we'd have to invest in getting some farmers to know about it. But once some know, knowledge spreads relatively quickly.
There has been some research, hasn't there, into the problems of market access for farmers, that even if they are successful in growing crops, it's difficult for them to get a good price for it.
And this is related to deep problems of infrastructure and low population density, and even more, a low density of economic activity generally. That tends to lead to market fragmentation, relatively small numbers of traders, relatively few options for farmers in either purchasing inputs or selling output. There's been really interesting new research on the structure of both input and output markets in agriculture. There are indications of market power on both these margins that make the cost of inputs higher and the value of outputs lower for farmers.
And one constraint that you raised that I hadn't really thought about is incomplete property rights. How does that act as a brake on adoption of technology?
This is a really interesting set of questions. It opens up a whole can of worms. There's clear evidence that having property rights in land that are formalized and protected encourages people to invest in the land. They are more willing to make investments in land quality that will play out over a long period of time if they know that they're going to be able to have access to the land and its produce over time. Second, and parallel to that, the process of agglomerating land in order to make mechanization feasible is also dependent on having land rights that are clear and well-defined, that include the right to either rent out or to sell the land. If you don't have clear, well-defined property rights that include the ability to rent or sell land, it makes it difficult to use land as collateral to fund investment, makes it difficult to transfer land between people, and makes it difficult to commit to investments that will only yield their returns over time. So all of those argue for making land rights more clear, well-defined, and marketable. On the other hand, the current land tenure systems, which are very diverse, but at least in West Africa, tend to include the notion of usufruct rights over land by virtue of membership in a larger group, a larger family or a larger community, that because you're a member of it, you have rights to land. What that means is if people are in need of social protection, if people are suffering from not having enough assets, at a minimum, they can always get land. So there's no rural landless class in West Africa, at least. And that source of insurance and social stability generated by these informal land tenure systems that have costs also have this enormous benefit of not enabling the kind of rural wealth stratification that we see in other parts of the world.
Chris, there is a very interesting section in the Vox Dev Lit on what you call heterogeneity and the research into that. So heterogeneity of what? How is it making technologies less effective?
One thing that has come up increasingly in the literature over the past decade is the enormous importance of variation spatially across the African continent in the conditions of agricultural production. And this heterogeneity is physical, the type of soil, the type of land, the weather realizations, the availability of water or moisture, temperatures, enormous physical heterogeneity. But more importantly, there's enormous economic and social heterogeneity. Access to markets being relatively limited means that prices vary widely over geography. And so the relative costs and benefits of different technologies, of different crops, varies dramatically in a small space. Social heterogeneity inhibits trade, means that there have been different farming practices used over time, and so there are anthropogenic changes in the quality of land and the characteristics of land. That combination of features, this diversity that we see in Africa, leads to observations that yields or input use or crops grown varies by an order of magnitude more within a given square mile than it does in, say, Western Europe.
Does that also mean that if we have an RCT and it's successful within some context, but then it's either scaled up or used somewhere else, then the results can be disappointing?
Or exciting. It could be.
I suppose,
it could go either way.
Yeah.
But it tends to go the other way because you get excited about an RCT when it works, and it might have worked because it's a great new technology or it's a great idea, a great new innovation, but it might have depended upon the realization of something random that happened that year in that place. Or it might be something that is not random, but a characteristic of that place that made it so that that intervention worked there where it won't work somewhere else. It does make the process of developing new institutions, developing new technologies, or learning about the profitability of new technologies or new institutions for farmers themselves much more difficult.
I guess it factors back into all of these constraints that we've been talking about, because it means that the work you put into understanding how constraints in, for example, markets work in one region, they might be entirely different in another.
We've found that again and again and again. Credit constraints matter a lot to farmers in Mali. They matter much less to farmers in northern Ghana. And how they would matter to farmers in a part of Malawi that I haven't read about, I don't know.
So, Chris, if policymakers, well-intentioned policymakers, want to respond to these insights into heterogeneity, of course, they need to know as much as possible about their context and other context where that knowledge comes from and the potential of technologies in those contexts. Do we know enough about that in detail yet? Is there enough investment in finding out about it?
No, we're not close to knowing enough about that. The density of research into specifically agriculture, but in fact, almost anything economic in Africa is just way too low. We don't know enough about the distribution of constraints and opportunities that are relevant for different farming systems in different areas. We sometimes have enough observations. Actually, credit constraints would probably be one of the ones that we know most about. We may have enough observations from enough places that we can at least develop a theory or a story about why it's important in one place and not another. And that's what we need in order to generalize from one RCT or one well-understood innovation in one place to another place. We have to understand what's driving the heterogeneity.
Where's this understanding going to come from? Because by its nature, heterogeneity crosses regional and national boundaries. Is there a role for the private sector and private-public partnership in this?
I think there's a role for the private sector for sure. In fact, if we don't get the private sector involved, I think we're going to be in real trouble because the resources that private sector firms can bring to bear on a problem are just so much larger and can be so much more intensively focused than public resources. Finding ways of building connections between farmers themselves, the formal public agricultural research system, private researchers, and the extension systems is really an essential building block.
There is one question that we always end up asking when we are discussing agriculture, and that is the impact of climate change, because we're talking about heterogeneity. We're seeing more extreme weather, and we're seeing the change in climate and therefore agricultural possibilities in the same area. Does this make it very urgent to acquire this knowledge and to apply it?
It does. An agricultural system like those that exist in most of Africa, where there's very little irrigation, and so almost all agriculture is rain-fed, means that the reliance on how weather changes is extremely high. One advantage that African agriculture has is its very heterogeneity. It means that there's a lot of resources in different places that will become more relevant in other places as climate change occurs. And so we need to make sure that this cross-fertilization of technologies across the continent is strengthened.
Chris, what would happen if we do not adequately solve this problem in the next few decades?
What is already happening in Africa is the gradual movement of households and individuals from dependence on agriculture to non-agricultural activities. That's part of the reason we're seeing the decline in yields, is the departure of people from agriculture is coming because they have better opportunities outside agriculture. And as they get better opportunities outside agriculture, that raises the opportunity cost of labor and encourages a switch from labor-intensive methods to more land-intensive methods, and yields go down. If we don't solve the challenges posed by increasing global warming, that process will be the only process we have for helping people who are in agriculture, that is, moving them out faster. That's going to make them poorer during this transition than they would have been otherwise. Improvements in technology that can help farmers deal with the challenges of global warming means that the process of transforming as people move out of agriculture will be much less painful.
Chris Udry, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
So your reference for this is the VoxDev Lit, Agricultural Technology in Africa, Issue 2. If you want to know anything about this topic, this is the place to start. The senior editors are Tavneet Sori and Chris Udry. This has been a VoxDev Talk. The best way to make sure you don't miss an episode is to subscribe. You will find us wherever you get your podcasts. Our past episodes, as always, are at voxdev.org.